Welcome to the World War II Discussion Forum, Winter and Spring Series. I'm Greg McNiff, the founder and executive director of the group. Before I introduce this afternoon's speaker, I want to briefly cover the usual housekeeping items. First, our speaker has graciously agreed to take questions after his prepared remarks. You have two ways to ask a question. You can either use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I will read out your question to our speaker, or if you prefer to ask your question directly, please use the raise hand feature at the bottom of your screen, and I will call on you to unmute your line. Regardless, please be respectful of our speaker and the audience when asking your questions. We'll take maybe 15 or 20 minutes of questions and go to about 2 p.m. New York, which means the total event would last about an hour. Second, donations are always appreciated. Please note there's a donate tab on the website. Third, we now have a YouTube channel, which can be accessed through the icon at the top of the website. As a reminder, this talk is being recorded for that channel and will be posted shortly after its conclusion. Fourth and finally, you can send any feedback through the website at wwiidf.org. Now to this afternoon's speaker. Flint Whitlock is a former U.S. Army officer and Vietnam War veteran and the award-winning author of 17 books, the majority of which deal with World War II. He has appeared on the History Channel and in numerous documentaries, leads battlefield tours, and was the editor of World War II Quarterly magazine for 12 years. Notable titles include Desperate Valor, Triumph at Anzio, Given Up for Dead, American POWs in the Nazi concentration camp at Berga, and The Fighting First, the untold story of the Big Red One on D-Day. Flint lives in Denver, Colorado. Today, he's going to discuss his latest book, Patton and the Battle for Sicily, the General of the Navy in Operation Husky, which covers the history of Operation Husky as it unfolded, with much of the Allied leadership facing internal conflict. Not surprisingly, the reviews have been top shelf. I'll just read two, both of which are from friends of this group, namely Alex Kershaw, writing, Flint's new examination of Patton and the Battle for Sicily is an important reminder of Patton's flaws and genius, and a beautifully crafted tale of a great general's relentless drive for glory and victory. While John McManus, who has also spoken to us, concludes, George Patton was indisputably a master practitioner of mechanized and maneuver warfare, but he knew a little something about amphibious operations too. In this fascinating book, Flint Whitlock puts us at Patton's elbow as he works closely with his naval and aerial colleagues during one of history's greatest invasions. In this sense, Flint introduces us to an overlooked side of one of America's most famous generals. Highly recommended. With that, I'm thrilled to have Flint, and I will turn it over to him.
Well, hello, Greg. Thank you for inviting me to be on this forum, and we appreciate the opportunity to discuss Patton and the Battle for Sicily. It was a fascinating topic to work on. I was approached a couple of years ago by Steve Catalano, and is the acquisition editor at Naval Institute Press. And when he was fulfilling a similar role out here in Colorado with Westview Press in Boulder, he edited acquired a couple of my manuscripts and published them. And it was good to see Steve again after many years. And he came to me, we were having lunch, and he said, how would you like to write a book about the Sicily operation? I said, well, that sounds interesting, but it has to include Patton in the title because George Patton is still a well-known figure. And I said, he was obviously instrumental in the Operation Husky, the conquest of Sicily. And so he said, that's a great idea. Let's have Patton as a major player in that. And so he gave me a deadline of 2 years. I think it was 80,000 words maximum. And I almost brought it in under the 2-year deadline. But I said, Steve, I'm going to need about 20,000 words to finish this. And so he granted me the extra 20,000 words. The result, as you mentioned, is Patton, which my virtual background being in the way, Patton and the Battle for Sicily. I don't know if that's reversed mirror image on the screen, but it is on mine. So at any rate, that's how it all came about. I'd been to Sicily 3 times. I'm going to be leading a battlefield tour there in a couple of months for the Minnesota World War II Roundtable. And I've been to Malta, where some of the action takes place. And 2 years ago, I was in Tunisia, where some of the invasion itself was launched. So I feel like I've been a war tourist with regard to working on this particular project. Have I lost you, Greg? I don't see you.
No, I'm here, Flint. I'm just off camera, but you're doing fine, loud and clear.
Good. Well, what can I tell you about the operation that you and people on the podcast, the Zoom call, might be interested in knowing about?
Yeah, maybe you could start with how you approached the book. I know there's been a fair amount of work on Patton, what you thought you discovered that was a little different about Operation Husky. And I see already there's a few hands raised. So if people have questions, I'll call on you. But maybe you could start with that, Flint, what you think's unique and what you learned
Sure.
relative to previous. Yeah.
Well, one of the things when I started doing research on this, I have 2 books previous that touched on Sicily. One was called The Rock of Anzio, which was about the 45th Infantry Division and their role at the Battle of Sicily, and the other one was called The Fighting First, which was about the 1st Infantry Division. Now, both of those used Sicily as kind of a springboard to their other campaigns, like Italy and southern France and Germany, and the 1st Infantry Division, Sicily. They had fought in North Africa during operation there, and then fought in Sicily, and then were sent to England to prepare for the Normandy invasion. But so I had a little bit of background writing about those 2 units. And the other thing that really, I couldn't have done this book without the help of Patton diaries and letters that are in the National Archives and that are available online. So you can actually go in and see Patton's handwritten diary and be able to follow his campaign, his career along through that, which is quite extensive. The other thing that I found kind of interesting is the fact that the movie Patton came out in 1970, starring George C. Scott, and he won the Academy Award for Best Actor in the Picture, won the Best Picture Award. Is that unlike many Hollywood war dramas, this one is very faithful to Patton's career. Much of the dialogue that came from Patton's diaries and letters. So I was treading on somewhat familiar ground, but there were a lot of things that I didn't know. For example, the feud that he had with Admiral H. Kent Hewitt, who brought his Western Task Force over from the U.S. for the invasion of North Africa, Operation Torch in 1942, but also provided the lift and the naval fire support for Operation Husky. So from North Africa, Hewitt's forces were transporting the American Army, 7th Army, to Sicily. And what I hadn't been aware of, and certainly the movie Patton doesn't talk about it, is the fact that Patton and Hewitt had a very strained relationship. They would get into shouting matches during the planning period. And it got to the point where Hewitt went to General George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, and said, "Couldn't you find somebody other than Patton to lead the Operation Torch operation. And I guess Marshall basically said, no, we two are stuck with each other. And so they kind of worked out an uneasy alliance for the good of the two operations, Torch and Husky. But Patton was very dismissive of Hewitt's capabilities as a naval officer and as a commander of such a large armada to take part in both of these amphibious operations. So that was one of the things that really surprised me. I got into the diaries and started looking at the animosity that Patton had towards his naval counterpart. And I tried to bring that out in the book, that even though they had this very strained relationship, they still were able to work on making sure that the operations were successful.
Great. There's already a number of hands raised. James, I'll call on you first, and then I'll go to Jim, and then I'll go to Brandon.
There, good afternoon. Thanks so much. I think it's only fair to ask a historian to draw some conclusions from the work. And as Patton is in the title of your book, I have three quick questions to ask you about him.
Okay.
Number one, you cover all three of these issues in your book, but I was hoping to get a bit more of a conclusion. Number one is, was Patton responsible for the worst friendly fire incident of World War II? And if he was not, who was responsible? Second question is, was Patton responsible for inciting U.S. soldiers to massacre POWs in Sicily? And did he attempt to cover up such massacres when they took place? And thirdly, do you think Patton should have been relieved of command and sent back to the United States after he repeatedly struck soldiers, threatened to shoot at least one of them in the face, and yelled out to a crowd afterwards, "There is no shell shock. It is an invention of the Jews"? Thank you.
Thank you, James. Good questions. Well, let's address them one at a time. The friendly fire incident that James is referring to is on the second night of the airborne drops. The 82nd made 2 airborne drops. The first night was the 505th that dropped, I guess you could say, behind enemy lines, inland from the coast. And that went well, in quotes, only in regard that they didn't run into any friendly fire incidents as the 504th did the next night. That drop was the first night combat drop in airborne history. And as you might imagine, things don't always go well when you're doing something for the first time. And so the 505th was scattered over 50 square miles of Sicilian territory. And I think when James Gavin came down and landed, hurt his ankle badly when he landed in rocky terrain. He looked around, instead of having 2,700 men in close proximity, he had 7 men that he could find. And so he spent the whole night until dawn trying to round up more troopers so they could go and fulfill their mission. The second night was the deadly one when the 504th under Reuben Tucker was dropped over Sicily. And what had happened there was the Germans had launched an aerial attack against Hewitt's ships lying offshore during the night, and were bombing and strafing the ships. And the Navy gunners, the American Navy gunners, were understandably unhappy about this, and so they were firing back at the Germans. And it was a full-scale air and naval battle taking place off the southern coast of Sicily. And as it turned out, the aerial attack ended just a few minutes before the arrival of the transport planes carrying the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment. And the men on the ships, they couldn't tell the difference in the dark who who was enemy, who was friendly. So they just continued to fire and ended up shooting down a couple dozen, as I recall, C-47 transports and killing, I believe it was about 124 American paratroopers and aviation crewmen. So that was a disaster, probably the worst friendly fire disaster of World War II. The massacre that you refer to was when the 45th Division was battling for the Comiso Airport inland from the landing beaches. And what had happened here was, the backstory on this was a few weeks earlier when the 45th Division had come over from the U.S. and were in North Africa, and Patton, they had never been in combat before, unlike 1st Division, 3rd Division. So Patton was giving him kind of a pep talk, and he gave him a warning. He said, don't be surprised if the enemy fakes a surrender. And when you go out from your covered positions to take these enemy soldiers prisoner, that additional enemy still in hiding don't jump up and begin shooting at you. And if this happens, feel free, you have my permission to kill the soldiers who were pretending to surrender and kill those who were trying to kill you. So some of the 45th Division soldiers took this message to heart. And when they got to the Comiso airport and they were engaged in a firefight with Italians there at the airport who were defending it, there was a group of Italians who emerged from their hiding places with their hands up and were walking towards the soldiers, the Americans. And sure enough, the Americans go out to take these men prisoner, and men still in hiding, the Italians still in hiding, opened fire on them. And so the Americans killed all of the prisoners who were pretending to surrender, and anybody else who was trying to fire at them. And that happened in 2 instances on the same day at the same airport, at the Comiso airport. One of these incidents was you might say commanded by a captain and the other by a sergeant. And both of these men were court-martialed, and they used as their defense, well, Patton told us if this happens, this is what we should do. And so the captain was found not guilty, so returned to duty, and unfortunately he was killed in combat, I believe in France, the next year. The sergeant was given a life sentence, but it was commuted after a year, and he also was returned to duty with a different infantry division fighting in Europe. So that was the story behind those 2 related massacres. And then do I believe that Patton should have been in the command because of his slapping of the 2 convalescing soldiers. And in the movie Patton, you may recall that I think it's Tim Considine who's in the credits. He's the soldier who gets slapped. He's never named. In actuality, in August of early August of 43, Patton is visiting a hospital, and he sees a soldier who's obviously in some emotional distress, and he asks him what's wrong, and the soldier says, I can't take the shelling, it's my nerves, and Patton slaps him and threatens to shoot him and tells the hospital people not to admit him and send him back to his unit. And then about less than a week later, Patton was visiting another evacuation hospital in northern Sicily, and he comes across a very similar situation. A soldier is just having a great deal of difficulty, and again, Patton slaps him, threatens to shoot him, sends him back to his unit, and the gist of this was that both soldiers were suffering from malaria. So in addition to whatever combat fatigue they had, they were also physically ill. And but Patton didn't want to hear that. He wanted to shame them, hopefully restore their sense of responsibility as a man and a soldier, and get them back to be effective combat soldiers. This is held down for a little while. The knowledge wasn't widespread until November that year. The journalist Drew Pearson broke the story in his newspaper and radio broadcasts. And you might say the brown stuff really hit the whirling device at that point. Eisenhower had been notified by the hospital personnel about what had happened with Patton, two slapping incidents, and he said, "This is, this is something that I can't condone. Don't let it happen again. I'm not going to let anybody know that this went on." But somehow the word got out, and Drew Pearson blew the whistle, and so Patton was in a great deal of hot water, and that probably did a lot to keep Patton in Sicily, basically doing nothing, while the rest of the war went on without him. But I think Eisenhower felt that Patton was too valuable a commander, even though he showed very poor judgment and did things that would have gotten somebody else court-martialed. And he wanted to hold on to Patton and not have him court-martialed, sent back to the States, because he was getting ready for the invasion of Normandy at that time. And as it turned out, and as they point out, those two slack corporals did more to win the war for the Allies than any other corporals or enlisted men did, because Patton was put in charge of what was considered a ghost army, a non-existent force that was leaked to the Germans that he would be leading this non-existent force across the Pas de Calais from England. And so the Germans bulked up their defenses in the Pas de Calais area when in fact the invasion took place much further. So should he have been court-martialed? Should he have been relieved of command? I have a lot of respect for Patton, and I understand why he did what he did, and I talk a little bit about that from extracts from his diary in the book. Maybe a lesser general would have gotten sacked, but Patton, I'm going to make an excuse for him and say he was wrong to do what he did, but in the end result turned out for the greater benefit of the Allied cause and the ultimate victory.
Great, thank you.
If I could just follow up and ask, just in terms of, was Patton responsible for the friendly fire incident at Gela, and did Patton attempt to cover up the massacres at Biscari?
I don't know that he attempted to cover up any massacres at Biscari or Comiso. I guess it was Biscari. I misspoke there. There were two airports in the area that the troops were fighting. It was Biscari. And was he responsible for the friendly fire incident? I would say no. If anybody was responsible, it would have been Hewitt in the Navy. The problem was that in the dark, after the Navy ships had been attacked by the German aircraft, and then the wave of transport planes, the American transport planes, came over very close to ships. The Navy didn't know that these weren't, this wasn't another wave of German attack. So, and you may recall that after this incident, it was decided for all planes going into the Normandy invasion area, that they would have 3 white stripes painted on their wings and fuselages as a way of identifying friendly aircraft in the dark. So, you know, the tragedy led to a lessons learned, and we were able, hopefully, to prevent a similar disaster from happening again. But again, you know, I'm thinking these poor sailors manning the anti-aircraft guns on the ships. They've just been attacked, and now here comes another wave, 100 and some transport planes, and they can't tell, you know, in the dark what army or what air force that belongs to. So they just started blasting away. And you know, was Hewitt ultimately responsible? Well, you know, the Navy guys were his men, so you know, I shouldn't have to pin it on him. But I think it was one of those unfortunate accidents of war that happened all too often.
Right, just one quickly, and then I'll move on, but or drop out of the queue. But didn't both Ridgway urge against the drop and Hewlett urged against the drop, and Patton overruled them? And then at the last moment, Patton decided to try and call off the drop, but it was too late. And in terms of the Biscari Cosimo massacres, I mean, you start one of your chapters in the book with Patton's quote saying, just say they were snipers or something. They weren't POWs, and they're dead already. There's nothing that can be done about it. It sounds like he tried to cover up the massacre.
Yeah, I think he was trying to minimize what had happened and maybe minimize his responsibility by telling troops previously to not let the enemy pull those sorts of dirty tricks on them. But what was the first part of the question?
General Ridgway
Oh,
had said he did not want his men dropping directly over the Navy and the shore-based anti-aircraft, and there was shore-based anti-aircraft that shot down most of the planes, I understand it, along with the Navy. And that Hewitt also said, I can't guarantee the safety of those planes if you have them come right over my fleet. But Patton overruled them and then tried to call off the drop at the last moment because he realized he had made a mistake.
yeah, originally they were supposed to fly east out of Tunisia and then make a dogleg left to the northwest and come in over the southeastern tip of Sicily. It's kind of shaped like a triangle. And that way wouldn't have taken them over the ships that were off the southern coast there. But because of navigational errors, some of the planes ended up getting a little too close to the naval ships and were struck by anti-aircraft fire. But you're right, the night before the invasion was to launch, there was this rather severe storm that blew up in the southern Mediterranean, kind of between Tunisia and Sicily. And Patton was worried that this was going to mess up the airborne phase of the operation. I mean, according to everything that I found in my research, he tried to do that, but for one reason or another wasn't able to reach the air bases in Tunisia to tell them to postpone the operation. So that's why that happened. It's the phrase, the best laid plans of mice and men. No matter how well you plan an operation, look at every contingency, inevitably something's going to go wrong. And that was the case at the start of Operation Husky. And I think it's similar to what happened in Overlord, the Normandy. There was a storm, the entire operation got delayed for a day. Things like whether you can predict them, but you can't really understand how severe it's going to operation. So
Great, thanks, James. We've got a few.
Great. Thanks for the time.
yeah, thank you.
Jim, if you want to unmute your line and ask your question.
Another Jim.
Jim, are you there?
Can you
Yeah,
hear me?
barely. I gotta turn my video off. The sound's a little muffled, but we can hear you, Jim.
You can't hear me well?
Oh, that's better. Yeah. Okay.
Usually I blame that shit on Trump. All right, anyway. Um,
I mentioned it was being recorded, right? Okay.
that's all right. That's all right. I'm not using anything. FCC, you can go on the air these days. Anyway, Flint, thank you so much for your work. I've enjoyed reading your books over the years.
Oh, thank you.
And I particularly enjoyed your history of the 45th Division because I had the great pleasure many, many years ago to deal with Felix Sparks.
Ah, yeah.
So, and I think you come from Denver, so I'm sure you met him when you were younger.
Well, I
Uh,
interviewed him for my 45th book shortly before he died, and Alex Kershaw got to interview him too after I did, and he wrote his book, The Liberator, about Felix.
So I have a feeling I have probably a lot more hours of tape than a lot of you guys do. So I have several questions. First of all, as a historian of, and Felix, I was interviewing the members of his battalion who went into Dachau that day, including the company commander. And what struck me about my experiences at that time, which was in the early 90s, was there were millions of World War II veterans still alive.
Right.
And now we have little to none. We're dealing in a society where people will normalize arguing about Hitler, which is quite extraordinary to see in our body politic. And I'm wondering, as my first question is, as a World War II historian, how do you see the memory of this changing in your lifetime? Because you've been writing about books of the Second World War for quite a long time.
Yeah.
The second question is the issue of Husky is always part of a wider debate starting really from the spring of 1942, but really you could say probably after Pearl Harbor. And that is, what are we going to do in terms of our focus of attention? Are we going to go right to Europe, or are we going to do the Pacific, or what? And then we have the diversion into the Mediterranean. And as you know, some will argue that the resources for Husky could have been used to essentially land in France, whether one buys that or not. So I'm wondering, in looking at Husky, what thoughts you had. And finally, with Patton. Now, Patton, of course, is a quite controversial figure. I've talked to people who've written biographies of him. When Carlo Desti was writing his biography, I would talk to Carlo when he was writing it. And, you know, you got a real interesting, complicated character there. How do you see him working with the other allies in the Sicilian campaign?
All good questions, Jim. Excuse me there.
Goes untight.
Well, that was more of a cough. Maybe it was a snuff, I don't know. How will World War II look in the future when veterans and the survivors are no longer with us? And that day is coming very, very soon. I was very lucky in that most of the books that I wrote about World War II, and I've got 13 of my 17 books on it, I was able to interview the participants, the eyewitnesses, the survivors. And I was aware of your concern as well, because I remember when Eisenhower went into the
Ohrdruf.
into Ohrdruf, the sub camp of Buchenwald, that he wanted, he ordered units. You know, this was in April 11th, well, earlier than that, early April, we'll say, of 45. The war is still going on for another month in Europe. And Eisenhower said, I want all the units that aren't actively engaged in fighting, who are in Germany or Eastern France, to come to Buchenwald and see firsthand the evidence of what the Nazis were doing with their concentration camps. Of course, Auschwitz had been liberated in January of 45 by the Russians. And up to that point, the world really didn't know what was going on behind barbed wire. I mean, there were stories of people who escaped and told about what was happening, but, you know, they were widely disbelieved. And it wasn't until April when these camps started being uncovered by the Russians British and Americans and French, that the full scope horror was revealed to the world. And Eisenhower said, I want these troops to see this firsthand. And I want you, General Marshall, to send over as many congressmen and newspaper and magazine editors as possible to document what's going on. Because at some point in the future, I'm afraid, and he said this, that people will deny this ever happened. And so we have, I think, in our culture today, and I think it's very dangerous, that we have people telling lies. They go on their podcasts or their websites or whatever social media that they use, and they make up fantastic stories that just aren't true, just to either make a political point or to get people riled up to perform illegal actions. I mean, who knows what their motivation is? But yeah, this has worried me a lot, that, you know, when the people who were there are gone, and they are even now disbelieved for telling, and authors like me, this is what I saw, this is what I did. You've got to tell the story so that people will remember it and won't forget the lessons of the past. Well, we are currently forgetting the lessons of the past. So I do worry about that, and I don't know that there's any way that we can get around it. People can lie and do what they will for their own benefit. And we just have to keep saying, well, you weren't there, these people were, this is what they told us, this is what they wrote down, this is what they were interviewed and what they said. Your second question about, was Husky necessary? All sorts of other places, these 166,000 troops and thousands of ships could have gone. And General Marshall, of course, he argued against that in the Casablanca conference in January of 42.
43.
43, thank you. Nobody said there'd be any math. General Marshall was one of those who was kind of advocating for not going into Sicily to get our troops out of the Mediterranean and into England and be prepared to make the big cross-channel invasion. Of course, we had, you know, again, there are all these other voices that are being heard, other complications that are going into the equation. We have Stalin in the Soviet Union saying, you know, I need a second front. I'm holding back the German hordes, you know, all by myself. And guys, Brits and Americans, you're not doing anything. You're not doing enough to take the pressure off of my country. And so we have Stalin saying, we've got Churchill saying, you know, let's keep the forces we have in the Mediterranean now, because we need to keep the Mediterranean open. We've got to keep the Suez Canal open. We've got to keep the lifeline to the Middle East open. You know, we need to have a major campaign in the Mediterranean. We can continue to build up troops in Britain for the inevitable operation, cross-channel operation, but we need to keep this front active in the Mediterranean. And so there were all these people pushing and pulling as to what was necessary. And personally, having, you know, studied the Mediterranean campaign probably more than I've studied any others, it was probably the best of several bad alternatives, you might say. I think the U.S. Army wasn't ready to hit the shores of Normandy in 1943. I mean, we barely, you know, been able to defeat the Italians and the Germans in North Africa when our troops had outnumbered theirs. So, you know, it took a period of time to get our forces and our materiel ready, the supplies. When I was in Vietnam, I was a logistics officer. one of my jobs was making sure our troops had enough of everything they needed to fight with. And so, even though the U.S. was still the arsenal of democracy, and we were still, almost 100% industrial capacity by that time, we were still churning out tanks and trucks and jeeps and drilling for oil and converting it to gasoline. And, our farmers were growing food that was feeding our own troops as well as our allies. We still weren't ready for the Normandy invasion. And in fact, it was a close run thing. It could have gone either way if a couple of decisions had been made differently. Normandy might not have succeeded. So I think that Husky overall was the right thing to do. It led to the downfall of Mussolini, led to Italy dropping out of the war. It created a lot of, and a second front for the Soviet Union. So it created a lot of positive things. Certainly we can nitpick and say, well, this didn't go right and that was dumb and what have you. But I think overall, it was a positive thing and led to a positive outcome. And then your third question about Patton, can you restate that again?
Patton's relationship with the Allies during the campaign itself.
Yeah. Well, as I said in my preamble to our broadcast here, Patton had problems dealing with other people, whether it was his naval commander or whether it was General Montgomery or Field Marshal Alexander or General Eisenhower. He was a very strong personality. He had his weaknesses. He could be, very, very much self-doubting and wondering, am I doing the right thing? Am I making the right decisions? But he was very contentious and wanted to always paint himself as the guy who knew the right answers. Even Field Marshal Alan Brooke, it doesn't get much better in terms of egos, but for Patton to say he was just, not very, very effective, really shows a lot about Patton. And I think if you're going to lead hundreds of thousands of men and you're going to risk those men and material, millions of dollars in a military campaign, you can't be stricken with self-doubt. You've got to feel that you know what you're doing more so than anybody else does, and that you are the best that there is. And in fact, in one of the excerpts from Patton's diary, he says, I am the best that there is. So there was never any doubt in his mind that if he was given the ability to lead an army the way he felt should be, that he would be much more successful than anybody else. And I think he proved that to a certain extent in Sicily, when Montgomery and Alexander said, well, we want you just to guard the left flank of Montgomery's 8th Army as they go up the east side of Sicily towards Messina. And Patton was very unhappy about giving that kind of secondary role. And so he said, well, I'm going to figure out a way that I don't have to follow that. And he goes to Alexander and he said, I'd like to have a reconnaissance in force. And Alexander said, oh, yeah, that's fine. Not telling Alexander how, that the reconnaissance in force was practically the entire 7th Army. So they took off from the southern beaches and made it to Palermo in a week. And while Montgomery is still struggling along the eastern shore of Sicily. So I think if Patton had been an overall command of Operation Husky, it might have reached a successful conclusion much quicker than it actually did. So I give him a lot of props for
Well, thanks a lot, man. It's great to see you in the flesh.
Well, thank you very much. I'm older now than I used
No kidding. Okay.
to.
Thanks, Jim. We'll take our next question from Brandon. Brandon, if you want to unmute your line and ask your question.
Yeah, you can hear me?
Yep, we can hear you, Brandon.
So this sort of dovetails with Jim's first question, but it comes from a different angle. I was recently listening to a podcast, and I believe it was Alex Kershaw when he was promoting his book Patton's Prayer about his role in the Battle of the Bulge. But if it wasn't him, then it was Rick Atkinson. And what I was saying was, in doing his research for that book, um, he discovered that Patton's wife, who was a long-term, I mean, she was worse than Libby Custer in some ways, in the sense of not just sort of encouraging a hagiography for Patton, but what she was apparently doing, and this may be second nature to you, or you may not have even heard about this, I don't know. She would literally, she was doing this while he was alive, going back and editing memoirs when they had a grudge against someone who she felt if they published a memoir that slighted George or in any way, shape, or form, things didn't go well. She would go back more than him and edit prior diaries or memoirs. And then when he got killed, which was you know, earlier than people thought he was going to die, obviously, she basically took over full time. So what, and again, I think it was Alex Kershaw was saying was he got to the point where he would look for a change in handwriting or anything like that that showed that she had altered the historical record. So I just wondered if you could comment on that, if this is something that historians have long known about or is a recent thing, and Kershaw was just the first one to go public with it.
Well, that's very interesting, Brandon. I know that she was very much involved in his career. And she was a great defender of his, especially after the slapping incidents were
Yes.
exposed to the American public. And Drew Pearson was writing his columns about that. But I'm not aware of the depth of what B. Patton had done. So I'm going to have to look into those sources you mentioned because whereas I was able to see the letters that he was writing to her and correspondence from her back in while he was in Sicily, I didn't get into that aspect of their relationship or her influence over how she wanted to see the public respond to her husband. But that's a very interesting approach.
Yeah, he gave very specific examples of things she changed. It wasn't like this was a vague accusation.
Nice.
So anyway, I just wondered.
Yeah. Well, thanks for bringing that up. It's always good to get new information on these podcasts and learn a little bit more of the complete.
Great. Thanks, Brandon. Mike, if you want to unmute your line and ask your question.
Yes, like everybody else, I'll have to ask this. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Read you 5 by 5.
Great. Well, full disclosure, I think that Patton was among the most overrated generals of the Second World War. Not that he was an excellent tactician, terrible strategist, in my opinion. But and it doesn't surprise me that he would have problems with the idea of mental disorders being introduced into the military sphere. But my questions, two questions, actually. One was going on that assumption was because he eventually became commander of Third Army after Sicily. And was that, and I'm not the only one who feels this way, that was probably the highest level of command that he was qualified for. I was wondering if you would agree with that it was probably not a good idea to put him in overall command of anything, given a lot of his limitations. And that leads to my second question, because one of the first questioners brought this up, but I don't think you addressed it yet, which is when he said that he didn't believe in battle fatigue. He thought it was a product of the Jews. His racism, and it wasn't just towards Jews, obviously, but his racism, along with his animosity towards, or its inability to deal with other people, and his animosity with Monty and many of the other people, and along with his pettiness and obvious mental, psychological, let's call them peccadillos. Do you think that had an adverse effect on his ability to command, especially as a leader of men, and that also his reputation may have been overrated after the war by people who, at least some of the people who might share his, what I believe to be fascistic tendencies? Sorry, that was complex. The complexity of that question.
Yeah. Good questions, Mike. And it's good that you bring up some of these negative aspects about Patton's character and personality. I don't whitewash him in the book where he deserves to be criticized. I criticize more. I quote other people who criticize him. And so your first question about, do I think that being in command of the Third Army is the highest level of military command achieved? And I think you're probably right. It was interesting that there he has General Omar Bradley, who after, go back a few months here, after the situation in North Africa has been won by the Allies. And at that time, Patton is he becomes the commander of Second Corps or Two Corps from Fredendall. And then when the decision is made to invade Sicily, and the Seventh Army is going to be formed, command of Second Corps or Two Corps goes to Bradley, and Patton regards, he writes in his memoirs that he felt that Bradley was extremely mediocre as a commanding officer. But by the time of the Normandy invasion, Bradley is now commander of an army group for the U.S. And Patton is stuck in Sicily as an army commander without an army to command, and he doesn't know, what the future holds for him, if he's going to have a role in the Operation Husky or just what. So I think people above him, probably Eisenhower and Marshall, felt that Patton was a good decoy. He could fool the Germans into thinking he was the top American general, and that's why they built this fictitious army around him in Dover, England. But you're probably right that he had probably reached his, what they call his level of incompetence, and so he probably, if he had lived, and if the war had gone on any longer, or if the command structure had been somewhat different, he probably would not have risen to be either an army group commander or even Supreme Allied It's just too volatile, too mercurial, making bad judgments from time to time. But as you said, a terrific tactician. He knew how to attack the enemy and defeat the enemy. So I think your point is well taken. As far as racism goes, again, I think there's a conundrum because when we look at the U.S. military prior to 1948, when President Truman instituted desegregation, up to that point, we had segregated platoons, we had segregated battalions, we had segregated ships, we had segregated just about any level of the American military. You had the black contingent, you had the white contingent, and never the two would meet unless it was for a brawl in a bar in New Orleans or something. And I think Patton was a product of his time. Remember, his relatives had fought on the Confederate side, and so his ancestry was more or less tied to his Southern identity, even though he wasn't. Well, I'm not going to say that. He did have a black personal steward, I guess you could call him, who helped him get dressed in the morning and did personal chores for him. But again, he was, I guess, regarding the black sergeant as a servant or even a slave to some extent. But it's interesting to look at his character in terms of the tenor of the times. There was a lot of racism throughout the U.S. So not only racial racism, but there was anti-Semitism that was rampant. And so, George Washington had slaves, Thomas Jefferson had slaves. So, these men were products of their time, and certainly we can criticize them, but I think we also have to look at the kind of society in which they grew up. Very few people were willing to change the status quo, even while saying all men are created equal. It's just part of human nature.
Well, just to follow up, but his, shall we say, fascistic tendencies, which among the people that I talked to who served in under Patton, there seemed to be, and this is just my limited assessment, there seemed to be more people who were in praise of him who didn't serve under him than there were of those that did serve under him. And I was wondering if these and his fascistic or fascist tendencies, and his character flaw there, if that affected his leadership ability among troops from a democratic society. And again, yes, there was rampant racism in the United States as well as in the United States military, obviously. But I was wondering if that, in general, these kind of like what I would consider fascist tendencies on his part personally, if that affected his leadership as a leader of men, so to speak.
Give me an example of this fascist tendency that you detected.
Well, the idea that, well, obviously the racism is part of that, but I do know in one instance, somebody told me that when they were in training, he observed when troops were being told to advance into a creeping barrage, which is in training, and men weren't advancing fast enough, he would literally kick them in the rear end. And he did this with numerous men, even though he himself wasn't advancing. And that's one particular example. He also one time in France decided, because he wanted to, this may not be fascist, but it certainly was, had to do with some of his character flaws. He told his general, the general commander of the Fourth Armored Division, General Wood, which also brings up the idea that perhaps most of the credit for what Patton did, or much of it, should go to his divisional commanders. But he ordered General Wood to run his tanks out of gas because he wanted to get the petrol from Montgomery. And he wound up leaving them in an extremely vulnerable position, because he wanted them to run their tanks out of gas bone dry.
Yeah.
And he basically left them as hostage to Supreme Headquarters so that he can get the gasoline.
Yeah, well, there's no doubt that that Patton was falling back upon some tactics and techniques that generals and commanders have used thousands of years, not being caring enough about the welfare of his men, that he would feel the need to sacrifice the big picture. And I'm not defending him or anything, I'm just pointing out what I hear him saying here, that he did drive his men, and he felt that he was driving himself just as hard for his station in life. I mean, he's not going to go out there and lead a bayonet charge, but I think, you know, his heroes of the past were always the hard charging generals, whether it's Hannibal or Julius Caesar or Napoleon or whoever. It was men who said, you know, I don't care if my men are cold or hungry and haven't had rest for 3 nights. We've got to accomplish the mission. And for him, the mission was all important, and damn anybody who didn't feel the same that he did. Of course, he had his own detractors, men who felt that they were being pushed too hard. And he had other people in his command who said, what a great general it is. It's an honor to follow him. So I would say maybe the votes are still out as to how history ultimately determined whether he was a great soldier or whether he was a martyr. I don't know, because there are aspects of both in his character. Definitely.
And the last thing, I'm sorry to take up so much time, hog the time here, but the last part of the question, do you think his reputation has been enhanced by people today who share his, shall we say, fascist tendencies, and basically may possibly unduly advanced? Because I would say that I still remember when the movie Patton, which I'm afraid I thought was overrated also, but when the movie Patton came out, President Nixon went to see it, and then after seeing it came out and said, which is, I believe, about the Manson trial, Charles Manson trial, he said they should execute him. I mean, the man's guilty, they should execute him while the trial was going on.
Well,
so
yeah, I've heard a president say we should execute people who tell active duty soldiers to obey the law. So
yes, that's what I was referring to.
I'm not going to go too far down that lane, but yeah, there people say dumb things.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Mike. We'll take Flint. How are you for time?
I'm great. I'm here all day tonight. So, you know, however long.
Okay, the last person who said that went 4 hours. I'm actually not joking. Mark, Gary, and maybe we'll close with Don. So, Mark, if you want to unmute your line, we can take your question.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your time, sir. My question, it's kind of twofold. But it's basically, so to what extent did the Allies achieve tactical surprise, strategic surprise because of Operation Mincemeat?
Yes. Yes.
When it comes to the actual German forces on Sicily, I can't quantify exactly, but they were able to get most of their forces off of Sicily and back onto the mainland. And I'm wondering if, in terms of that German success, was that more a matter of the Germans being good at what they do, or something, a failure or a mistake of some sort on the Allies' part? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mark. Let me just write this down. I might have you
Yeah,
react.
no problem. Yeah, of course. I'll do anything.
But you bring up mincemeat, and that's a wonderful diversionary operation. I don't know. I'm sure everybody on this podcast knows
Oh, I'm
what
sure.
mincemeat is, which was British plan to dress up a corpse from a London morgue and dress him up in Royal Marine uniform and put some fake orders in a briefcase chained to his wrist and send him by submarine to the southern coast of Spain and throw him overboard and let him drift into shore where he was found by the Spanish authorities and turned him over to the Germans, who opened the briefcase and found these orders that looked to be genuine, that seemed to indicate that the Allies, after North Africa, were going to invade Greece at the far end of the Mediterranean. And Kesselring didn't believe it, Mussolini didn't believe it, but Hitler did. And so he ordered at least one division, I think it was the 1st Panzer Division, from Italy to bolster the troops that were already occupying Greece. And again, this, I love deceptive operations. What Patton did in England to make the Germans think that Patton was going to an army or an army group across the Pas-de-Calais, was one of the brilliant deception operations in history. And I would put mincemeat probably second rank there because it did cause the Germans and to some extent the Italians to say, maybe Sicily isn't the next step to Italy. Maybe they're going to bypass Italy altogether and go to Greece and come up through the Balkans. It's an interesting bit of tomfoolery that the Allies played on the Axis troops. What was the second part of the question, Mark?
Well, the first question actually was, to what extent did the Allies achieve surprise in Sicily? Were the German commanders, the Italian commanders surprised? Oh shit, they are hitting us. And the second question was the fact that the Germans were able to withdraw from Sicily in good order, whether that was a more of the Germans being good at what they do, or the Allies making a mistake or something.
Yeah. I don't think that the Italians or Germans were surprised when Husky was launched on the night of July 9th. I think they knew something was going to happen, even though their radar station and air base at Pantelleria had been knocked out prior to the invasion, so that the Italians and Germans couldn't be sure that the invasion force had left North Africa and was heading towards Sicily. The beach gunners and the anti-aircraft gunners and the air bases on Sicily, they were all on high alert. I think they knew they were going to get hit. Whether it was going to be a diversionary operation or the real thing, they probably couldn't understand at that particular time. But I don't think that they were caught by surprise. So and then to the second part of your question about the withdrawal of the Italians and Germans from Sicily, from Messina, across the Strait of Messina. I call it in the book, and maybe other historians have as well, a Axis Dunkirk, when the Germans had invaded Belgium and France in 1940, and they were pushing the British Expeditionary Force and the French Army up to the northern coast along the English Channel there. And the British and French evacuated back to Britain at Dunkirk. I mean, that's always been regarded as what a wonderful tactical retreat that was. It enabled the French and British to fight another day, even though they left most of their equipment behind. And I don't think enough praise has been poured onto the Germans and the Italians for their successful escape out of Sicily, because I wrote down some numbers here that the Germans and Italians evacuated 110,000 men, plus lots of vehicles and tanks and artillery pieces, which enabled them to continue the fight on the mainland of Italy. I think we are sometimes loath to give our enemies any credit for doing something well. And certainly the operation was called Unternehmen Lehrgang, that enabled Axis troops to escape to the mainland. And the fact that we didn't follow up, we didn't try to stop them. We had all this naval power, air power in the Mediterranean there, and almost none of it was used to interdict this escape route. And people like Bradley made excuses, and they said, well, the Italians and the Germans had a lot of anti-aircraft weapons down there at the Strait of Messina on the Italian side, and they mined the strait heavily. And if we had tried to send in ships and planes to interdict them, we would have taken way more casualties, and we didn't realize how successful it was. So, I think we don't give the Axis enough credit for successfully getting out of Sicily with as many men and as much material as they ultimately did.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks a lot, Mark. Gary, if you want to unmute your line and ask your question.
Hi. Yeah, so I just want to react against this idea that's out there in the historiography and common discussion about D-Day, that if the Panzers had only gotten to the beaches in time, they would have driven the Allies back into the sea, et cetera, forgetting the fact that the 16th Panzer Division was already at the beach at Salerno when they landed, and also related to the actions at Gela, which gets to my comment I want to have you react to, which is I really feel like the Salerno, together with Gela, even more so, demonstrates, or at least gives strong evidence towards the proposition that the Allies' real ace in the hole against German armored forces was not their tactical air, which didn't, as you relate in your book, doesn't really come into play at the beginning of the campaign, but their naval gunfire. Well, a combination of their own organic firepower, anti-tank firepower, which comes into play, which sometimes is forgotten, but the real ace in the hole is naval gunfire. So I'd like you to react to that statement, but I also want to say one other thing, and hopefully it's not too long of a comment. You can react to that as well. And with respect to the idea, and I know Jim probably baited me with this early second front question, but as you say, the Germans, you can talk about what they said, but what's really important is how they moved their forces. And they started to move forces down into Italy and into Sicily within weeks of Tunis falling. They moved far more into Italy than they did into the Balkans or into Greece. As a matter of fact, after Mincemeat, they took a division off of Crete. They had one less division. So they everything that wasn't going to Kursk went to Italy, pretty much. And with the result that in July of 1943, when Husky went down, there was only one Panzer division in France. It didn't have it, and the best tank it had was the Mark III, which was a month away from being declared not front capable by the German army. So it was way inferior to even a Sherman, much less a Churchill in terms of tank on tank engagement. One Panzer division. There was two understrength infantry divisions in Normandy, as opposed to 6 fully strength ones in 1944, including a Panzer division, which was just behind Sword Beach. So it was wide open in 1943. The opportunity was there. The problem was, unlike what's said, I don't really see anything in I haven't read through the whole thing, but I don't see where Marshall in any of the public discussions or the recorded discussions says anything about in opposition to continuing a campaign in the Mediterranean. And I think it's because at the time, there was a big logistics crisis going on in Britain. It'd fallen to its lowest level of the entire war. It's something that's kind of glossed over, but it's in the statistics there. I think that if they wanted to, the opportunity was there, as I just described. But on the other hand, they would have had to make the decision in January or February to start moving the logistics over, transferring them up to Northwest Europe. And at that point in time, it just didn't seem like it was possible. Whether it would have been or not is an open question. I tend to think it would have been. But at the time, you can hardly blame them based on the state of worldwide logistics shipping at that time, that they couldn't see anything but to continue the campaign in the Mediterranean. And I just want to say to my friends there, like Jim and Mike, I do have my article on sledgehammers going to be published next week in the U.S. Naval War College Review. So hopefully you guys will see it. And I'll leave it at that. So you can comment on my 2 comments. Thank you.
Is it Garrett? Is that the name? Well, you brought up some very interesting things. First of all, I think you are absolutely right about the naval gunfire at Gela when the Italian and German tanks started rolling towards the town to try and drive the 1st Infantry and the Rangers back into the sea. And in the book, I talk about the fact that Patton comes ashore on the 10th of July, and how he likes to get his fingers in all the pies, and he's trying to organize the chaos on the beach, and he eventually goes inland. He was intending to meet up with Terry Allen of the 1st Infantry Division because he didn't think Allen was moving inland fast enough. So he gets into the town of Gela, and he runs into Bill Darby, commander of the Rangers, and they're up on top of the building, and they're looking at the battlefield to the north of them, and they see these tanks coming, and Patton, for some reason, there's a naval communications officer there with a radio, and he said, get your goddamn Navy on radio, tell them to drop some shells onto these attacking tanks. And the naval officer gives the ships the coordinates where the tanks are coming. And so there's this barrage that comes in and basically halts the tank attack cold. And as you said, that's a wonderful, perfect example of how naval gunfire probably saved the day on Sicily in the middle of the invasion area. And it was something, there was no air support to speak of. In fact, the Army Air Forces said, well, if you want air support, you have to put in your request 24 hours in advance. Not everybody can do that and say, I think the enemy's going to attack me tomorrow, or maybe it was 12 hours, one or the other. But the Air Force was not prepared to respond the way the Navy was. And if you look at Normandy as well, the same thing happened, but at least in this case, they did lay on sufficient bombers to hit the coast of Normandy, but unfortunately they bombed too far inland and left all of the beach guns and emplacements untouched, and it took I think it was 8 American destroyers to come in and practically scrape their hulls on the sands of Omaha Beach to knock out the German emplacements at near point blank range. So, thank God for the Navy, as the destroyer were told at Normandy. And the same thing, of course, happened at Sicily. Now, with regard to your other your question, I'm trying to read my notes here. Yeah, can you give me your second question again in a condensed?
Well, it was really just a comment on, Jim had brought up the prospect of what if they'd use those resources,
Okay,
the amphibious resources. And I'm saying the opportunity was certainly there, because it was, that never was it weaker than in July of 1943. Everything had been sent to Kursk, all the tanks had been sent to Kursk, and what little was left over was sent to Italy, with the exception of 1st Panzer, as you said. But much more went into Italy than went to the Balkans. But anyway, they would have had to make the decision months ahead of time, and at that point in time, I'm little to let people off the hook, but I really do think that looking at the evidence at the time, it would have been hard to come to that conclusion. But the opportunity was there, and the resources were there, because it was never weaker than in July of 19. The German defenses in France were never weaker than July of 43.
You're probably right on that. I remember there was a book that came out, I want to say about 25 years ago, called 1943, The Invasion That Never Was. And I probably read it 25 years ago, so I don't.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that. Even though I agree with the conclusion, it wasn't a very good book. A lot of factual mistakes in there.
Okay.
But I've done a lot of research on the German side. That's what a lot of people don't do. I spent a lot of time in German archives and go to their archival sources rather than relying on the recollections of officers after the war or what somebody else wrote in some other book.
Right.
So you go to the sources, you get a better picture, I think.
Yeah, I can tell that's where your deep dive was, and I appreciate that. And I guess the only thing I can say is that our intelligence about the enemy side was faulty. Maybe propaganda enabled the Germans to make the Allies think they had more and better stuff than they actually did have. And we didn't know that until after the war, and we can get into their archives. I will defend my ignorance that way.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gary. Don, if you want to, you want to ask your question, we'll close out with you.
How's that?
Yeah.
Flint, how are you, sir?
Colonel Patton, how are you?
Good to see you. Say, I actually want to talk about Patton in Sicily rather than all these other things. Would you consider what Patton did an envelopment? And did he realize the limitations of the roads that he would try to move the 7th Army on? I mean, I guess I don't know the fact, but he probably moved at least twice, maybe 2.5 times as far with Gela to Palermo to Messina as Montgomery did from the British landing zones to Messina. can you comment on the route, and was he aware of the limitations to move that army?
Very, very, very good question. Certainly, when you look at the routes of march of both 7th Army and 8th Army, you can see how much longer the 7th Army route of march was than the British. The British had to go from basically the southeast corner of the island northward in a straight line to the northeastern corner of the island, which is maybe 100 miles. For Patton's 7th Army, they had to go, well, he split his army into two. One half of it he sent to the west coast of Sicily, which is probably 90 to 100 miles. I don't have a map in front of me, but roughly that distance from the landing beaches to the western shore, where they cleared out enemy forces that were holding the western side of the island, because obviously the Axis didn't know where on the island the Allies would land, so they had basically try and defend everything. So there were German and Italian forces on the west side of the island.
Right.
Half of Patton's troops took rather easily, and then the other half he sent straight north from the landing beaches to Palermo, which again is about 100 miles. And then the troops that went to the west side, and after they had conquered the enemy there, they cut across kind of at a 45-degree angle to the northeast to go to Palermo. And about this time, the 9th Infantry Division was coming ashore from North Africa. They've been held in reserve. And so now you've got Patton's entire 7th Army in the north shore of Sicily. And it's about another 100 miles from Palermo to Messina going to the east. So, you know, Patton's men have probably doubled the amount of road that Montgomery's troops had to cover. But I would say in Montgomery's defense, they were facing tougher opposition than the Americans did on the western half of the island. So whether Patton knew that he could do that or not, I don't know. The roads in Sicily at that time got great. They didn't have any autostradas like the rest of Italy does, or autobahns like Germany had. They were just, you know, basically 2-lane roads, some of which, you know, probably wouldn't support a tank. Germans, when they were retreating along the northern coast of the island, they were blowing bridges behind them, and at that point, you know, they're just sheer cliffs,
Right.
and the road cut into like a shelf almost along the cliffs. And when the Germans would blow that, the Army engineers would have to come along and build a temporary bridge so that troops and vehicles could cross that. But I think that the fact that Patton and his troops did as well as they did in their much longer route of march really says a lot for not only the tenacity of the American fighting man, but also the ingenuity and skill of the combat engineers who were able to, you know, fix a bridge, or, you know, repair a highway. It was remarkable for a 38-day campaign that they were able to accomplish everything they did.
Well, I wish I was going to be with you when you retrace that here in a couple of months. So, yeah.
And I'm going to be in Minnesota in a couple of weeks for Don Patton's World War II history roundtable. We're going to be talking about this very same subject that we're talking about here today.
Right. Look forward to seeing you.
Great. Thanks again, Don. Always appreciated. That concludes our talk for today. Thank you to our speaker for a great lecture and Q&A. Again, the book is Patton and the Battle for Sicily, the General, the Navy, and Operation Husky by Flint Whitlock. Please join us next Saturday, March 7th at 1 p.m. when historian Justin Laborde will discuss his book, Scattered Far and Wide, the Naval Academy Class of 38 at War, which tells the war stories of this class of midshipmen. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and we look forward to see you next week. Thank you, everyone, and have a good day.
Thank you, Greg.